They called them houses of God, but they were built on the backs of fear. When people look at the grand cathedrals of Europe, they see beauty, craftsmanship, devotion, but beneath the stone and stained glass lies something much darker. They were monuments not just to faith, but to the human capacity to surrender reason when fear takes hold. Fear wasn't an accident in the story of Christianity's rise. It was a deliberate tool, a psychological lever that turned human insecurity into a structure so vast that entire generations lived and died under its shadow. The medieval cathedral wasn't only a place of worship, it was a physical reminder that salvation had a price, and that the church held the key to paying it. If you were a peasant in the 12th century, life was already harsh. Famine, disease, war, these were everyday realities, but none of it compared to the terror of eternal damnation. The church didn't invent fear, but it perfected how to use it. When the Bible was read in Latin, inaccessible to the masses, fear filled the gaps that understanding could not. Every sermon, every ritual, every carving of demons at the cathedral gates reminded people that they were born guilty, that their only hope of escaping hell was obedience, tithes, and prayer under the church's authority. The irony is striking. The very same buildings that stood as symbols of hope were financed by fear. People were told that giving money to build a cathedral could shorten their time in purgatory, or the time of their loved ones. The church turned the afterlife into an economy. Sin became currency. Forgiveness became a product, and the cathedral became its marketplace. When you look at the massive spires reaching towards heaven, it's easy to forget that the people who paid for them barely had bread to eat. Entire villages were taxed, guilted, or coerced into funding these projects, because refusing wasn't just seen as defiance, it was risking your soul. The grandeur of Notre Dame, the splendor of Cologne Cathedral, the sheer scale of Chartres, these weren't built because people wanted to display beauty. They were built because people were terrified not to. What the church understood better than any ruler or army was that fear could motivate people more effectively than force ever could. Fear doesn't require chains, it builds its own inside the mind. And when belief in hell becomes indistinguishable from fear of authority, submission becomes not just expected, but moral. Even the architecture itself was part of this psychological machinery. Step into a Gothic cathedral. You feel small, overwhelmed. The towering ceilings, the echoing halls, the dark corners where light struggles to reach, all of it designed to humble the visitor, to remind them of their insignificance before God. The structure itself preached a sermon. You are nothing. He is everything. And in practice, he often meant the church. This wasn't simply about faith. It was about social control. A farmer who feared eternal punishment would obey. A craftsman who believed salvation depended on donation would give. Fear turned devotion into labor and labor into legacy, the church's legacy. There's a strange kind of genius in that. The same system that promised spiritual freedom enslaved the human mind, and people called it holiness. The beauty of the cathedral was built from the ugliness of manipulation, yet no one dared question it, because questioning was dangerous. To doubt was to sin. To challenge the church was to risk eternal fire. In a world without literacy, the cathedral itself became a book. Its stained glass windows told stories of saints and sinners. Its sculptures displayed the torments of hell. Every surface was a warning, every image a lesson. The church understood that not everyone could read the Bible, but everyone could understand fear. Fear was universal. A noble feared judgment for pride. A peasant feared punishment for disobedience. A widow feared the eternal fate of her dead husband. The church had something to sell to each of them. But here's what's often forgotten. The building of these cathedrals wasn't only about collecting wealth, It was about solidifying psychological dominance. By creating a visible, awe-inspiring image of divine power, the church reinforced its invisible control. When you walked past those walls, you didn't just see God's house. You saw your place in the hierarchy of existence. Even today, those cathedrals stand as testaments to human creativity, but also to how effectively fear can be dressed up as reverence. They are masterpieces of art and masterpieces of persuasion. Behind every stained glass saint stood a system that taught you to fear yourself, your thoughts, your desires, your doubts. Fear wasn't just preached, it was carved into stone. The message was simple. You are born sinful. You cannot save yourself. Only through obedience to the church can you find mercy. And what better proof of that power than these colossal monuments to submission? The beauty of the architecture distracted from the ugliness of the system that made it possible. People admired the light streaming through coloured glass, not realizing how that light was paid for. In fear, guilt, and labour extracted through spiritual extortion. It's easy to romanticize the Middle Ages now, to see these cathedrals as symbols of unity and devotion. But unity built on fear isn't unity, it's conformity. And devotion born of terror isn't love, it's desperation. The church learned to make fear feel sacred. They preached humility but demanded obedience. They claimed to serve God but served their own institution. And every new cathedral was proof that the system worked. Even kings knelt before bishops, terrified of divine wrath. The church didn't need armies. It had the human imagination as its weapon. It could wage war inside people's minds, turning their own fears against them. The worst part, it wasn't always malicious at the individual level. Many of the priests and craftsmen genuinely believed they were serving something greater. That's the power of belief mixed with fear. It doesn't feel like oppression. It feels like purpose. Faith turned into a machine. A self-sustaining cycle of fear, guilt, and repentance. And that machine built cathedrals that would outlast empires. But the question that lingers is, why did fear work so well? Why were people so easily persuaded to give everything they had, even their sense of self, to an institution built on promises no one could verify? Because fear isn't just emotional, it's existential. When life is unpredictable and death is constant, the promise of certainty, even false certainty, phenomena becomes irresistible. The church offered that, a structure in the chaos, a story that made sense of suffering. All you had to do was surrender your doubt and your freedom, and people did, willingly, generation after generation. They believed because not believing meant facing the terror of the unknown. The church didn't have to force belief. It just had to make disbelief unbearable. That's how fear becomes faith, and how faith becomes power. The fear of the unknown, that was the cornerstone. The church didn't need to invent new threats. Life already supplied enough. Plague, famine, war. But it reframed them. Every tragedy became proof of divine judgment. Every recovery proof of divine mercy. You couldn't escape the system because the system explained everything. If things went wrong, it was because you sinned. If things went well, it was because you obeyed. Fear wasn't an interruption to faith, it was faith. The cathedral embodied this logic in stone. It stood there like a constant sermon, saying, this is what happens when humanity surrenders to God. But what it really meant was, this is what happens when humanity surrenders to fear. You see, the church didn't build cathedrals to bring people closer to God. It built them to keep people dependent. The very size of the structure ensured you never forgot how small you were. Those walls rose above the town like a reminder that no matter how far you roamed, you were still under its shadow. When you walked through those enormous doors, the air itself changed. You'd feel the cold stone, the echo of footsteps, the faint scent of incense. Every sensory detail was deliberate, a way to trigger awe, humility, surrender. It wasn't just a building, it was a psychological stage, and the church was the director. In those spaces, people didn't just pray. They confessed, they wept, they begged, because they truly believed that every wrong thought, every forgotten prayer, every small act of rebellion was seen by an invisible eye. Fear makes people honest, but not free, and that honesty was exploited to build power. What's fascinating is that the church didn't simply threaten hell, it offered protection from it for a price, and that price wasn't always money. Sometimes it was loyalty, obedience, silence. Sometimes it was your ability to think for yourself. The indulgence system is a perfect example. A church official could literally sell forgiveness. Give coin, say prayer. Buy time off your suffering. The more afraid people were of the afterlife, the more willing they were to pay for relief. It wasn't spirituality, it was spiritual blackmail. And yet, it worked. The cathedrals rose higher and higher, as fear reached deeper and deeper into human hearts. Every new structure required more money, more labor, more promises, and each one reinforced the illusion that the church was indispensable. After all, only the truly powerful could command such beauty from chaos. In towns where literacy was rare, the cathedral was a kind of cosmic theatre. It spoke a language of images, angels, demons, flames, crowns. Every carving was a threat and a promise. The faithful didn't need to read theology to understand. The message was clear: obey or suffer, believe or burn. When you realize how much energy was poured into maintaining this emotional control, it becomes clear that Christianity's greatest architectural achievement wasn't stone. It was fear itself. The cathedrals were just its most visible form. And yet, amid that manipulation, there was also genuine beauty. The artistry of the stained glass, the mathematical precision of the spires, the music of the organs, all of it came from human hands. People think of those things as evidence of divine inspiration, but they were really proof of human genius working under religious hypnosis. The fear was the fuel. The art was the byproduct. But let's step back for a moment. Why was fear such a powerful motivator for these societies? Because Christianity didn't just threaten people with hell. It redefined their entire moral compass. It taught them that they were unworthy from birth, that to even question the church was rebellion against God. And when you convince people that their conscience itself is untrustworthy, you own them completely. This is why guilt became so central to Christian life. Guilt was the invisible tax that funded every cathedral. Even when people couldn't afford to give money, they gave loyalty or silence. The church's greatest victory was making fear feel like virtue. Every confession booth was an engine of control. You confessed not because you wanted to, but because you were afraid not to. You handed over your private thoughts to an institution that claimed the right to judge them. It was a brilliant system, self-surveillance disguised as salvation. And while people feared their own desires, the church accumulated wealth, land, and power unmatched by any kingdom. Cathedrals weren't just churches, they were financial centers, political statements, and symbols of unquestionable authority. The bigger the cathedral, the smaller the people who entered it. There's a reason so many cathedrals took centuries to complete. They weren't built for the living. They were built to remind future generations of who ruled their ancestors' souls. A family could live and die working on a single tower, never seeing it finished, but convinced their suffering would earn them heaven. That's how fear sustains itself. It passes down through stories, through ritual, through the illusion that obedience is sacred. And what's tragic is that this fear-driven devotion often silenced the very curiosity that could have liberated people. When fear rules, thought stops. You don't ask why you must pay for forgiveness. You just pay. You don't ask why a loving God requires your suffering. You just accept. The cathedrals became monuments to the victory of belief over reason. And that victory wasn't peaceful. It was psychological warfare. When we admire these cathedrals today, we rarely think about what they cost, not just in money or labor, but in minds. The cost was generations of people too afraid to question, too conditioned to doubt. Fear built those walls, but fear also built silence. Still, it's important to recognize how that fear worked so effectively. It was never just about punishment. It was about purpose. People feared hell, yes, but they also feared meaninglessness. The church didn't just scare people, it offered them a role in a cosmic story. That's what made it powerful. Because when you wrap fear in meaning, people will protect it, rather than escape it. They'll build cathedrals with their bare hands. They'll defend the very institution that exploits them. They'll call obedience faith, and fear love. The genius of the system wasn't only in controlling people through terror, it was in convincing them that the terror was holy. The cathedral wasn't just built with fear, it was maintained with it. The art, the rituals, the relics, all of it was part of the same machinery. If the structure was the body of faith, fear was its pulse, keeping it alive through generations of obedience. Think about the art first. Those stunning frescoes and sculptures weren't simply decorations. They were sermons in stone and paint. Angels and demons weren't abstract, they were warnings. The Last Judgment scenes that covered cathedral walls showed writhing bodies dragged into flames, while the saved were lifted into light. There was no subtlety, no room for interpretation. The message was visual and visceral. This is your fate if you disobey. This is your reward if you comply. Even the gargoyles had a function. They weren't just rain spouts, they were symbols. Monsters perched on holy ground, staring down at the people below. They reminded everyone that evil lurked everywhere, that only within the church's walls was there safety. It's remarkable. The same figures that terrified children also comforted their parents, because fear that's shared feels like protection. And then came the relics, the bones of saints, pieces of the true cross, drops of the Virgin's milk, displayed behind glass, guarded by priests. Each relic carried power, or so people were told. Touch it, and your sins could be forgiven. Donate to its upkeep, and your soul could be spared. Relics turned fear into currency. The more frightened people were of hell, the more valuable a bone fragment became. It was a system that mixed superstition with business in perfect balance. If a town couldn't afford to build a full cathedral, it could at least acquire a relic. Pilgrims would travel, donate, pray, and every donation was an investment against eternal suffering. The church understood something profound about human psychology. It knew that fear and hope are two sides of the same coin. So it sold both, at once. You could be terrified of damnation on Monday and comforted by confession on Tuesday, all under the same roof. And the rituals reinforced the cycle. Confession, communion, baptism, funeral rites. Every stage of life was tied to ceremony, each with its own sense of threat and relief. Miss a ritual, and you risked your soul. Obey, and you gained temporary peace. It was a lifetime subscription to spiritual security. This wasn't conspiracy, it was structure. A psychological structure that ensured dependency. You weren't just part of the church, you were inside it, body and soul. The priest wasn't just a man, he was your mediator between terror and safety. That's why even kings knelt. When you control the fear of death, you control everyone. Now, some might argue that people also found comfort and meaning in these cathedrals, and that's true. But that comfort was conditional. It only existed because fear came first. You can't sell safety unless you first convince people they are in danger. That's marketing at its oldest and most effective form. Even today, this pattern hasn't disappeared. The architecture of fear still echoes in modern churches, though the walls are cleaner, the message is smoother. But the core remains, the promise of protection from punishment that no one can verify, through loyalty to an institution that claims authority it cannot prove. And yet, there's something undeniably human about it. Fear makes us seek control, and when control isn't possible, we seek symbols of control. That's what the cathedral offered. It turned helplessness into ritual, ignorance into belonging, and fear into beauty. It's easy to think of fear as something negative, but the church didn't just use fear to oppress, it used it to organize, to unify. People who were afraid together prayed together, built together, obeyed together. Fear was the glue that held medieval society in place. And the church, more than any kingdom or empire, understood that glue better than anyone. Because what happens when people stop being afraid? They start thinking. They start asking questions. They start wondering why they must pay to be forgiven, or why a merciful God needs so much gold. That's why intellectual curiosity was so dangerous. The church couldn't risk people interpreting the world through reason, because reason doesn't bend to fear. And so, knowledge was restricted, books were burned, and scientists who challenged dogma were silenced. The cathedrals stood as monuments to piety, while the minds of men were kept small. When the printing press arrived centuries later, it threatened the entire structure. Because once people could read the Bible for themselves, they realized how much had been filtered, twisted, or used to justify power. The Reformation wasn't just a religious revolt, it was the first real crack in fear's foundation, and it terrified the church, because a population that reads is a population that questions. Still, fear didn't vanish, it evolved. New fears replaced old ones. The fear of being wrong, of being damned, of being different. Even when the church lost political power, its psychological footprint remained. You can see it in the way people still speak about guilt, sin, shame. Those are the echoes of the same fear that once built cathedrals. And those cathedrals still stand. Tourists walk through them, snapping photos, marveling at their grandeur. They see art, history, beauty, but rarely the manipulation that made them possible. It's uncomfortable to admit that something so breathtaking could be born of fear. But that's what makes it so effective. Fear doesn't just build prisons, it builds masterpieces. The church's genius was not in creating fear, it was in sanctifying it. Turning terror into virtue, submission into salvation. So when people walked beneath those soaring ceilings, they didn't feel oppressed, they felt grateful. That's the most effective form of control. When the controlled thank their controllers. There's something chilling in that realization, that the same emotion that built civilization's greatest monuments also stifled its greatest potential. The same hands that carved angels into stone could have written books, invented machines, cured diseases. But they were busy atonement building. Not because they were forced, but because they believed. That's the tragedy. When fear becomes faith, oppression doesn't feel like oppression. It feels like purpose. And purpose, even false purpose, is powerful enough to build cathedrals that touch the sky. Even now, long after the stones have settled and the incense has faded, the architecture of fear still stands, not just in cathedrals, but in minds. We may think we've moved beyond it, that the modern world has outgrown medieval superstition, but the patterns remain. They've simply been repackaged, softened, disguised as morality, tradition, or humility. The same emotional reflex that made peasants kneel before bishops still shapes how people think about guilt, sin, and obedience today. Fear hasn't disappeared. It's just become subtler. It no longer builds cathedrals out of stone. It builds them out of shame. Every culture that inherited Christianity also inherited its emotional scaffolding. Even people who reject religion often still carry its psychological residue. That reflex to feel small before authority, to equate doubt with danger, to mistake suffering for virtue. Those are the echoes of centuries spent under the shadow of the cathedral. The church understood human psychology before psychology had a name. It knew that the fear of punishment shapes behavior more reliably than the promise of reward. That guilt, once internalized, doesn't need guards or chains. It polices itself. That's why the most powerful cathedrals were never the ones made of stone. They were the invisible ones built inside human minds. Look at how the concept of sin functions. It's a brilliant piece of control logic. You're born guilty, regardless of what you've done. And your only escape depends on the very institution that defined your guilt in the first place. That's not faith, and that's dependency wrapped in holiness. And once people accept that framework, you can shape entire civilizations around it. You see the remnants everywhere, in how people apologize for wanting too much, in how pleasure is still associated with guilt, in how moral worth is often measured by self-denial instead of understanding. That's the same formula the church used when it convinced people to trade food for forgiveness, fear dressed up as virtue. When the church told people to fear God, it wasn't asking for respect, it was asking for surrender. It turned humility into obedience, and obedience into identity. To question the church wasn't just dangerous, it was existential. It meant losing your place in the story that gave your life meaning. That's why fear worked so effectively. It didn't just scare people, it defined them. And the cathedrals were the perfect backdrop for that identity. They were more than buildings, they were visual theology. Every detail said something about human worth, or the lack of it. The massive pillars, the narrow windows, the towering vaults, they all created the feeling of being trapped in beauty. It's no coincidence that stepping into a cathedral often makes people whisper. It's awe, yes, but also submission. A conditioned silence passed down through centuries. Even now, in cities that pride themselves on being secular, the skyline still bears the mark of those towers. They rise above banks, museums, parliaments, symbols of a time when the most powerful institution on earth sold safety from eternal suffering. And people paid not just with gold, but with generations of fear. The church understood that fear wasn't something to eliminate, it was something to manage. If people were terrified without hope, they'd rebel. But if you gave them a way to redeem their fear, they'd obey forever. That's what confession, indulgences, and ritual achieved, and a rhythm of fear and relief that kept people psychologically hooked. It's the same rhythm that modern institutions still use, though with different language. Fear, guilt, absolution, repeat. Every advertisement that convinces you you're not enough, then offers a product to fix it, use the same mechanism. It's the old cathedral logic in a new cathedral of commerce. Fear works because it feels like truth. It feels deep, personal, and necessary. People rarely notice how it's been engineered. They just feel it. That's why the church didn't need to force belief. It built belief into emotion itself. And yet the irony is that within those same cathedrals, the seeds of reason were also planted. Artists, mathematicians, engineers, all working under the same roof that taught them to fear curiosity. They used geometry and physics to glorify a God who forbade them from asking how the world worked. The architecture of faith was built by the architecture of reason. But reason was never allowed to take credit. That tension between fear and understanding is what drove human progress forward, because sooner or later people began to see the cracks. They realized that if you could build something as magnificent as Chartres or Milan Cathedral using math design, and skill, then maybe the world wasn't driven by divine mystery alone. Maybe knowledge itself was sacred. And that realization, slow and fragile as it was, began to break the spell. The Enlightenment wasn't born in opposition to Christianity. It was born from people who had grown up in its shadow. People who finally began to ask whether the fear that built the cathedrals had been protecting them or imprisoning them. And once that question was asked, it couldn't be unasked. But even today, the emotional blueprint remains. The same fear that built cathedrals still whispers through moral systems, through politics, through culture. It tells people that certain questions shouldn't be asked, certain ideas shouldn't be entertained, certain freedoms shouldn't be used. The walls are no longer made of stone, but the structure still stands. Because the church never needed to keep people inside buildings, it just needed to keep them inside belief. The fear of eternal punishment may have faded, but its psychological descendants, fear of judgment, fear of exclusion, fear of meaninglessness, still shape the way people think. And all of them trace back to that same foundation, the one that taught generations to equate obedience with virtue and fear with faith. So when you stand before a cathedral today, you're not just looking at history, you're looking at an emotion made permanent, a monument to what fear can build when it's sanctified. It's beautiful, yes, but beauty doesn't erase its origin. It only disguises it. That's the paradox of Christianity's architectural legacy. The very structures that inspire awe were born of submission. The same walls that uplift the spirit once crushed the human mind. And the faith that claimed to free people from fear built its empire by perfecting it. If the stones of those cathedrals could speak, they wouldn't just tell stories of faith. They'd tell stories of hands that trembled, of lives spent in toil, of hearts that believed because they were too afraid not to. And they'd tell us something even deeper. That fear doesn't just build monuments, it builds history. The question now is, how much of that fear still lives in us? When we look at authority, do we still see it as sacred? When we feel guilt, is it conscience or conditioning? When we submit to systems, are we choosing or just obeying the echoes of the cathedral? Because if we can answer that honestly, we might finally see the architecture for what it is. Not a symbol of divine power, but a blueprint of human fear turned to stone. And maybe then, we'll start building different kinds of monuments. Ones not carved from obedience or guilt, but from understanding. Because the greatest structure humanity could ever build isn't a cathedral. It's a mind free from fear,